They stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Shokaku in the early morning hours of May 9, 1942, watching the grey waters of the Coral Sea fade behind them as the ship turned north toward Truk. The damage control teams had worked through the night, shoring up bulkheads and sealing compartments where American bombs had penetrated the flight deck. 3 direct hits, fires extinguished. Casualties counted and recorded. The ship was heading home for repairs, but she was afloat, under her own power, and her crew was intact enough to man their stations. Commander Takeo Takagi, who had led the carrier strike force through 4 days of unprecedented naval combat, reviewed the reports with his staff officers. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, confirmed sunk by multiple sources. The carrier Yorktown had been hit, trailing oil, last seen limping south toward Port Moresby with visible damage. The destroyer Sims was gone, sunk on May 7th. The oiler Neosho had been left dead in the water, burning. Japanese losses were significant, but, by the arithmetic of naval warfare as it had been understood up to that moment, acceptable. Shokaku was damaged but would return to service. Her sister ship, Zuikaku, was undamaged but had lost most of her air group. The light carrier Shoho had been sunk on May 7th, a loss that hurt, but light carriers were considered expendable compared to fleet carriers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The staff officers compiled their action reports with careful attention to detail. They recorded the tonnage sunk. They noted the enemy carriers engaged. They calculated the exchange ratio, the brutal mathematics that naval strategists used to determine victory or defeat in fleet actions. By these calculations, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a Japanese victory, not a decisive victory, not the kind of overwhelming triumph that had characterized the attack on Pearl Harbor or the destruction of the British Force Z off Malaya, but a victory nonetheless. The Americans had lost more tonnage. They had lost more aircraft. They had been forced to withdraw from the operational area. Most importantly, they had failed to stop the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. The reports went up the chain of command. They reached Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commanding the 4th Fleet, who had overall responsibility for Operation MO, the plan to seize Port Moresby and extend Japanese control over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Inoue studied the reports and recognized that while the tactical situation appeared favorable, the strategic objective had not been achieved. The Port Moresby invasion convoy had been forced to turn back. The operation was postponed, not cancelled, but postponed. This was not mentioned prominently in the reports that went further up the chain to Combined Fleet, Headquarters. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, senior officers received the news of the Coral Sea engagement with satisfaction. A carrier battle, the first in naval history where the opposing ships never came within visual range of each other, fought entirely by aircraft, and Japan had sunk more enemy tonnage than she had lost. The American carrier Lexington was confirmed destroyed. The Yorktown was reported heavily damaged, likely out of action for months if not permanently. Japanese losses were 1 light carrier and 1 fleet carrier temporarily out of service for repairs. The mathematics seemed clear. What they did not know, what they could not know from their position in Tokyo, reviewing reports compiled from fragmentary radio intercepts and pilot observations made during high-speed combat, was that their calculations were based on assumptions that were already obsolete. The assumptions were not about tactics or courage, or even about the immediate military situation. They were about time, about industrial capacity, about the fundamental nature of the war they were fighting. The Japanese believed they were fighting a naval war where carriers were precious, irreplaceable assets that took years to build and years to replace. They were correct about their own situation. They were catastrophically wrong about America's. The aircraft carrier, as a dominant weapon of naval warfare, was less than 20 years old in 1942. The concept had existed longer, but the technology and doctrine that made carriers the capital ships of modern navies had only matured in the 1920s and 30s. Japan had been an early innovator in carrier aviation, converting the battlecruiser Akagi and the battleship Kaga into aircraft carriers under the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. That treaty, signed by the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, had attempted to prevent another naval arms race by limiting the tonnage and number of capital ships each nation could build. The treaty defined capital ships as battleships and battlecruisers, the massive gun-armed vessels that had dominated naval thinking since the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. Carriers were included in the treaty but were given more lenient restrictions, partly because their potential was not yet fully understood, and partly because they were seen as supporting vessels rather than primary combatants. The treaty allowed Japan to maintain a carrier force with a total tonnage of 81,000 tons, compared to 135,000 tons each for the United States and Britain. This 5-5-3 ratio, as it became known, was intended to maintain a balance of power while preventing the kind of unrestricted building that had contributed to the tensions leading up to World War I. Japan accepted these terms with resentment. The naval leadership saw the ratio as an insult, a formal recognition that Japan was being treated as a lesser power. But they also saw opportunity. If they could not build as many ships as the Americans or British, they would build better ships. They would invest in quality, in training, in doctrine. They would create a naval force that could defeat a numerically superior enemy through superior skill and preparation. This became a fundamental assumption of Japanese naval planning. Quality would overcome quantity. Superior fighting spirit, better training, and more advanced tactics would compensate for numerical inferiority. This philosophy shaped every aspect of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Pilot training was extraordinarily rigorous, taking years to complete, producing aviators of exceptional skill. Ship designs emphasized capability over numbers, incorporating the latest technology, even if it made the ships more expensive and time-consuming to build. Tactics stressed aggression and decisive engagement, seeking to destroy the enemy fleet in a single, climactic battle. The assumption was that in such a battle, Japanese quality would prevail. The doctrine worked brilliantly in the opening months of the Pacific War. At Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft achieved complete surprise, sinking or heavily damaging 8 American battleships and destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground. The attack was a masterpiece of planning and execution, validating everything the Japanese Navy had believed about carrier aviation and surprise attack. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed that shocked Allied commanders. Hong Kong fell on December 25th. Manila was occupied on January 2nd, 1942. Singapore, the great British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered on February 15th with over 80,000 troops, the largest capitulation in British military history. The Dutch East Indies were conquered by March. Burma was invaded. Ceylon was raided. By April 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches to Australia. It was the most rapid expansion of territorial control in modern military history, and it had been achieved with relatively light Japanese losses. The success created confidence that bordered on certainty. Japanese strategic planning for the war had always been based on the assumption that America, once bloodied in the opening attacks, would lose the will to fight across the vast distances of the Pacific. The plan was never to invade the United States or to achieve total victory in a conventional sense. It was to make the war so costly, so difficult, so frustrating for the Americans that they would eventually agree to a negotiated peace that recognized Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. The early victories seemed to confirm this strategy was working. American naval power in the Pacific had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. The Asiatic fleet had been destroyed or scattered. British naval forces had been driven from Southeast Asian waters after the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya on December 10, 1941. For the first 5 months of the war, Japan had operated with virtual naval supremacy across a vast theatre of operations. But this supremacy rested on a foundation that was less solid than it appeared. Japan had begun the war with 10 aircraft carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. The fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soru, Hiru, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were the elite striking force of the combined fleet. The light carriers, Ryujo, Shoho, Zuiho, and Hosho, provided additional capability for secondary operations. These 10 carriers represented virtually the entire carrier construction capacity Japan had built up over 2 decades. There were no more carriers in construction that would be ready in the near term. Japan's shipbuilding industry was already operating at capacity, building destroyers, submarines, and merchant ships to support the expanded empire. More carriers were planned, but they would take years to complete. The Navy's pre-war planning had been based on a short, decisive conflict, not on a prolonged war of attrition. No one had seriously planned for what would happen if carriers were lost and needed to be replaced quickly. The American situation was different in ways that Japanese intelligence services did not fully understand. The United States had begun the war with 7 aircraft carriers in commission: Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. This was fewer than Japan's 10 carriers, supporting the Japanese belief in their qualitative superiority, compensating for rough numerical parity. But the Americans had something else that would prove far more important than the number of carriers in service on December 7, 1941. They had industrial capacity on a scale that Japan could not match, and they had already begun mobilizing that capacity months before the war started. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, authorizing the construction of 18 aircraft carriers among hundreds of other vessels. This was not a response to war. America was still officially at peace. It was a response to the deteriorating international situation and to President Franklin Roosevelt's belief that America needed to prepare for the possibility of conflict on 2 fronts, in both the Atlantic and Pacific. The authorization included funding for a new class of fleet carriers that would become the Essex class, designed to incorporate all the lessons learned from earlier carrier designs. The Essex-class carriers would displace 27,000 tons, carry 90 to 100 aircraft, and incorporate improved damage control systems, better armor protection, and more anti-aircraft weaponry than earlier designs. Most importantly, they were designed for rapid mass production. American naval architects and shipbuilders had studied the methods used in merchant ship construction and applied them to warship building. Standardized components, prefabrication of major hull sections, and parallel construction of multiple ships at different yards would allow the Essex class to be built faster than any previous fleet carriers. The first ship, USS Essex, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941. Keel laying was followed by hull construction, where prefabricated sections were assembled and welded together. The hull was launched on July 31, 1942, 13 months after construction began. After launch came fitting out, the process of installing engines, weapons, electronics, and all the internal systems that made the ship operational. Essex was commissioned on December 31, 1942, just under 20 months from keel laying to active service. This was fast by any standard, but it was only the beginning. By the time Essex was commissioned, 8 more Essex-class carriers were already under construction at shipyards across the United States. Newport News was building Intrepid. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard was building Lexington, named to replace the carrier lost at Coral Sea. Brooklyn Navy Yard was building Yorktown, named to replace the carrier that would be lost at Midway. Norfolk Navy Yard was building Hornet, named to replace another Midway loss. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was building Bon Homme Richard. New York Shipbuilding in Camden was building Hancock. Bethlehem's Fall River Yard was building Wasp and Bennington. Each yard had refined its construction methods based on experience. Each successive carrier was built slightly faster than the one before. The production Capacity represented an industrial mobilization unprecedented in scale and speed. American shipyards that had built merchant vessels and passenger liners were retooled for warship construction. Workers who had never built a warship before were trained in weeks or months and put to work on assembly lines that produced carriers the way automobile factories produced cars, only much, much larger. The total labor force in American shipyards grew from 170,000 workers in 1939 to over 1 million by 1943. These workers, including hundreds of thousands of women who entered heavy industry for the first time, worked around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The supply chain feeding these shipyards was equally massive. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, Gary, and Birmingham produced the armor plate and structural steel. Engine manufacturers built the steam turbines that would power the ships. Electronics companies produced radar sets, radios, and fire control systems. Weapons manufacturers built the anti-aircraft guns, from 20mm Oerlikon cannons to 5-inch dual-purpose guns mounted in enclosed turrets. Each carrier required thousands of different components, all of which had to be manufactured, transported, and assembled in the correct sequence. The logistics were staggering, but American industry had been building automobiles, locomotives, and heavy machinery for decades. The organizational knowledge existed. It just had to be scaled up and applied to warship construction. Japanese intelligence services knew the Americans were building carriers. They had sources that reported on ship construction, and they could observe the activity at American shipyards through various means. But they did not fully comprehend the scale or the speed of American production. Japanese analysts, working from their own experience building carriers, estimated that it would take the United States at least 3 years for authorization to commission a new fleet carrier. This was approximately how long it took Japan to build a fleet carrier using traditional construction methods. Based on this estimate, carriers authorized in 1941 would not be ready until 1944 at the earliest. This gave Japan a window of opportunity, a period of approximately 2 years when they would have numerical superiority in carriers and could establish a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to break. The Battle of the Coral Sea took place from May 4th to May 8th, 1942, in the waters northeast of Australia. It was the result of Japanese Operation MO, a plan to seize Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea and establish bases in the Solomon Islands, extending Japanese control and threatening the sea routes between the United States and Australia. The operation required multiple naval forces. A covering force built around the light carrier Shoho would provide air support for the invasion convoy. A striking force built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku would engage any Allied naval forces that attempted to interfere. Additional cruiser and destroyer groups would provide screening and support. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes through the effort known as Magic, knew the operation was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, ordered Task Force 17, built around the carrier Yorktown and commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, to the Coral Sea. Task Force 11, built around the carrier Lexington and commanded by Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, joined Fletcher's force. Together, the 2 American carriers, with their escorting cruisers and destroyers, would attempt to stop the Japanese advance. The battle unfolded over 4 days in a series of airstrikes, searches, and engagements spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. On May 7th, American aircraft found and sank the light carrier Shoho in a devastating attack that took less than 15 minutes. 93 aircraft from Yorktown and Lexington struck the small carrier, hitting her with 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank with heavy loss of life. It was the first Japanese carrier sunk in the war, and the speed of her destruction shocked Japanese commanders who had believed their carriers were more resilient. The next day, May 8th, both sides found each other's main carrier forces and launched full strikes. Japanese aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku attacked the American carriers through intense anti-aircraft fire. They hit Lexington with 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. They hit Yorktown with one bomb that penetrated the flight deck and exploded 3 decks below, killing or wounding 66 men. Both American carriers continued operating, launching and recovering aircraft even while under attack. Lexington's damage initially seemed manageable. Fires were brought under control. The ship maintained speed and appeared to be surviving. American aircraft struck back, hitting Shokaku with 3 bombs that penetrated her flight deck and started fires that required hours to bring under control. Zuikaku escaped damage by hiding in a rain squall, but her air group suffered heavy casualties in the day's fighting. By late afternoon on May 8th, both sides had withdrawn. The immediate tactical situation seemed to favour Japan slightly. They had sunk more tonnage, but at 4:47 in the afternoon, a massive internal explosion tore through Lexington. Aviation fuel vapours that had been leaking from ruptured tanks since the morning's attack had accumulated in the lower decks. A single spark from a generator that had been left running ignited the vapour, causing an explosion that wrecked the interior of the ship and started fires that could not be controlled. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Frederick Sherman ordered abandoned ship at 5:07. The crew evacuated in good order, with destroyers coming alongside to take off survivors. Over 2,700 men were saved. At 7:52 in the evening, the destroyer Phelps fired torpedoes into Lexington's hull to ensure she would not be captured. She sank shortly after 8 in the evening, taking with her 36 aircraft and 216 men who had died in the day's action or been unable to evacuate. The loss of Lexington was a blow to American naval power in the Pacific, but it was not the decisive blow Japanese commanders believed it to be. Yorktown withdrew south after the battle, trailing oil from ruptured fuel tanks, her flight deck damaged, her crew exhausted. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft shadowed her for hours, reporting she was heavily damaged and unlikely to remain operational. These reports reinforced the Japanese assessment that the battle had been a victory. They had sunk one American fleet carrier and put another out of action for months. Their own losses were 1 light carrier sunk and 1 fleet carrier damaged but repairable. The exchange rate favoured Japan. More importantly, it reinforced the fundamental assumption of Japanese naval strategy, that in carrier warfare, every ship lost was essentially irreplaceable in the near term, making any favourable exchange rate a strategic victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was already planning the next operation even as the Battle of the Coral Sea concluded. Operation MI, the plan to seize Midway Atoll, was intended to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. Yamamoto believed that with Lexington sunk and Yorktown heavily damaged, the Americans could deploy at most 2 carriers to defend Midway, Enterprise and Hornet. Against these, he would bring 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Shokaku would be in dock for repairs. Zuikaku would be in port rearming and replacing her depleted air group. But 4 carriers against 2 gave Japan overwhelming superiority. The plan seemed sound. What Yamamoto did not know was that Yorktown was already steaming at maximum speed toward Pearl Harbor, arriving on May 27, 1942, just 19 days after the Battle of the Coral Sea ended. Damage control assessments predicted repairs would take 90 days at minimum. The ship had bomb damage to her flight deck, ruptured fuel tanks, damaged elevators, and numerous other problems that normally required extensive shipyard work. Nimitz ordered the repair work done in 72 hours. It was an impossible demand, but the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard made it happen. 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown around the clock. They patched the flight deck with timber and steel plate. They welded new sections into the hull where bomb fragments had torn holes. They replaced damaged piping and electrical systems. They worked without pause, cutting corners where possible, making temporary fixes that would hold long enough to get the ship back into action. On May 30th, 72 hours after arriving, Yorktown left Pearl Harbor and steamed west to join Enterprise and Hornet at Point Luck, northeast of Midway. She was not fully repaired. She would need months of additional work after the coming battle, but she was operational, and she would fight. The Battle of Midway began on June 4th, 1942, less than a month after the Coral Sea engagement ended. Japanese commanders expected to face 2 American carriers. They found 3. The presence of Yorktown, a ship they believed was out of action for months, was the first indication that something fundamental about their understanding of American capabilities was wrong. The battle itself was a catastrophe for Japan. In the span of 5 minutes during the morning attack, on June 4th, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soru, catching them with armed and fueled aircraft on their flight decks. All 3 ships were set ablaze by bombs that detonated among the ready aircraft and stored ordnance. By evening, all 3 had been abandoned and would sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that found and severely damaged Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. But Hiryu was found and attacked by American aircraft later that afternoon, suffering the same fate as her sister ships. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk or sinking. Japan had lost the core of her carrier striking force, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. More critically, she had lost over 300 aircraft and approximately 3,000 experienced aircrew, pilots and aircrewmen, who represented years of training and combat experience. These losses could not be quickly replaced. Japanese pilot training programs, designed for quality over quantity, took years to produce fully qualified carrier aviators. The aircraft could be manufactured, though Japan's industrial capacity was already strained. But the pilots, the trained, experienced men who could operate from carriers in combat, were effectively irreplaceable in the time frame that mattered. Yorktown survived the initial Japanese attack on June 4th, her crew managing to restore power and get the ship underway after the first wave of hits. She was struck again by aircraft from Hiryu in the afternoon, taking 2 more torpedoes that left her dead in the water. The crew abandoned ship, and destroyers stood by to provide assistance. For 2 days, salvage crews worked to save the carrier, getting a tow line attached and beginning the long journey back to Pearl Harbor. But on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 found the damaged carrier and her escorts, firing 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing power and pumping services. Hammond broke in half and sank within 4 minutes. Yorktown, her hull opened by the new torpedo damage, finally rolled over and sank early on the morning of June 7th. She had fought at Coral Sea, been repaired in 3 days, fought again at Midway, and absorbed punishment that would have sunk most ships twice over. Her loss was a blow, but not the decisive blow it would have been to Japan. The strategic consequences of Midway became apparent in the months that followed. Japan's carrier force, which had begun the war with overwhelming superiority, was now reduced to 2 operational fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, neither of which had been present at Midway. The light carriers remained, but they could not project the same striking power as fleet carriers. Most critically, Japan had lost the initiative. The plan had been to expand the defensive perimeter, to seize more territory, and make the cost of reconquest so high that America would negotiate. But without carrier superiority, without the ability to project air power across vast ocean distances, further expansion was impossible. Japan would now fight a defensive war, trying to hold what she had already taken. This was precisely the kind of war Japan's strategy had been designed to avoid. American losses at Midway were 1 carrier and 1 destroyer. Within weeks, analysis began on what had gone wrong for Japan and what had gone right for America. Part of it was intelligence. The fact that American codebreakers had given Nimitz advance warning of Japanese plans. Part of it was luck, the fortunate timing that put American dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. But beneath these tactical and operational factors was a deeper strategic reality that Japanese planners were only beginning to comprehend. The 3 days it took to repair Yorktown, enough to fight again, represented something that did not exist in Japanese naval planning. the assumption that damaged ships could be quickly returned to service, and that lost ships could be replaced on timescales measured in months rather than years. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, 7 months after the Battle of Midway. She worked up her crew and air group in early 1943 and deployed to the Pacific in May, arriving in Pearl Harbor ready for combat operations. 13 months had passed since Coral Sea. In that time, the United States had commissioned 1 new fleet carrier and had 8 more in various stages of construction. Yorktown, the new one named to replace the carrier lost at Midway, was commissioned on April 15, 1943. Lexington, replacing the carrier lost at Coral Sea, was commissioned on February 17, 1943, 8 months. That was how long it took America to replace the fleet carrier lost at Coral Sea with a larger, more capable ship bearing the same name. The production continued to accelerate. Bunker Hill was commissioned in May 1943, Intrepid in August, Hornet, the second ship to bear that name, in November. By the end of 1943, the United States had commissioned 6 Essex-class fleet carriers, with more completing every few months through 1944 and into 1945. The final count would reach 24 Essex-class carriers built during the war, with more cancelled after victory was achieved. 24 fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons, each carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, each built in approximately 18 to 20 months, from keel laying to commissioning. The industrial capacity this represented was beyond anything Japan could match or counter. Japan, in the same time period from mid-1942 through the end of the war, would commission exactly 3 new fleet carriers. Taiho, laid down in July 1941 and commissioned in March 1944, represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design, with an armoured flight deck and improved aircraft capacity. But she was sunk by an American submarine 3 months after commissioning, on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, was commissioned in November 1944 and sunk by submarine 10 days later, while still working up, never having conducted combat operations. Unryu was commissioned in August 1944 and survived until December, when she too was sunk by submarine. 3 carriers, all sunk within months of entering service, against 24 American carriers that would form the core of the fast carrier task forces that dominated the Pacific in the war's final years. The mathematics were unforgiving. Japan had begun the war betting that quality and fighting spirit could overcome numerical inferiority. The bet worked in the opening months when Japanese carriers faced opponents who were unprepared, outnumbered, or operating with inadequate support. But once the war became a contest of industrial production and replacement capacity, the outcome was predetermined. Japan could not build carriers fast enough to replace losses. America could build them faster than Japan could sink them. By 1944, American carrier task forces operated with impunity, striking targets across the Pacific, with forces so large that Japanese defenders were simply overwhelmed. Task Force 58, the main American carrier strike force in 1944, regularly operated with 12 to 15 fleet carriers plus escorts. Japan had nothing that could challenge such a force. The men who had stood on Shokaku's bridge in May 1942, reviewing the action reports and calculating that Coral Sea had been a victory, were not fools. They were experienced naval officers working with the information available to them and applying the strategic assumptions that had guided Japanese naval planning for 2 decades. Those assumptions, that carriers were precious and irreplaceable, that favourable exchange ratios constituted victory, that quality could overcome quantity, were valid within the context of Japanese industrial capacity. The error was in assuming that American industrial capacity operated under the same constraints. It did not. American shipyards could build a fleet carrier in less time than it took Japanese shipyards to complete a destroyer. American training programs could produce adequate pilots in months, not the years Japan required for its rigorous training regimen. Adequate was not as good as excellent, but adequate pilots in overwhelming numbers flying from numerous carriers proved more than sufficient. The psychological impact of this realization on Japanese naval leadership was profound. Officers who had spent their entire careers believing that superior training, better tactics, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages found themselves facing an opponent who had material advantages so overwhelming that no amount of training or spirit could compensate. The despair this created permeated Japanese strategic planning in the war's final years. Operations became increasingly desperate, culminating in the kamikaze attacks that threw away trained pilots in suicide missions because there was no longer any realistic hope of conventional victory. The institutional knowledge that Japan had built up over decades of carrier operations was squandered, trying to hold off an enemy who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. For the Americans, the lessons were different, but equally significant. The rapid repair of Yorktown, getting her back into action in 3 days for Midway, demonstrated what could be accomplished when industrial capacity was mobilized with urgency and clear purpose. The shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor, who had made that repair possible, had done something that changed the course of the battle and possibly the war. 3 days. That was how long it took American industry to turn a heavily damaged carrier into an operational warship capable of fighting in the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The yards that built the Essex-class carriers took that same mentality and applied it to new construction, treating warship building as a problem of industrial organization and production efficiency rather than traditional craftsmanship. The workers, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war, learned to weld, to rivet, to assemble massive hull sections with precision. They worked around the clock in conditions that were often difficult and dangerous. They did this knowing that the ships they were building would carry men into combat, that the quality of their work would determine whether those men lived or died. The ships they produced were not perfect. They had flaws and compromises that peacetime construction would not have accepted. But they were good enough, and they were produced in numbers that changed the fundamental balance of power in the Pacific. By 1945, the question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but only how long it would take and at what cost. The Battle of the Coral Sea, viewed from May 1942 with the information available to Japanese commanders at that time, appeared to be a tactical victory. One enemy fleet carrier sunk, another heavily damaged, for the loss of one light carrier and one fleet carrier temporarily out of service. The strategic objective, the seizure of Port Moresby, had not been achieved, but the tactical exchange ratio favored Japan. The reports that went to Tokyo reflected this assessment. The victory was announced. The calculations seemed sound. What they did not know, what they could not know from their position, was that the damaged American carrier would be fighting again in less than a month. What they did not fully comprehend was that the carrier they had sunk would be replaced in 8 months with a better ship. What they had not grasped was that they were fighting an industrial power with production capacity so vast that losses which would cripple Japan were merely temporary setbacks for America. By the time they understood this, by the time the mathematics of industrial warfare became undeniable, it was too late to change the outcome. They had calculated victory using arithmetic that was already obsolete. The war they thought they were fighting, a war where carriers were irreplaceable and favorable exchange ratios led to strategic success, was not the war they were actually in. They were in a war of industrial production, of shipyard capacity, of how quickly a nation could build and replace complex warships. In that war, they had been defeated before the first shot was fired. They just did not know it yet in May 1942, standing on the bridge of a damaged carrier, steaming home, believing they had won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.